Somewhere along the front line in Ukraine, on a date this video cannot specify with certainty because the war is still being fought as this is written, a tracked vehicle built on a familiar infantry fighting vehicle chassis swings its turret skyward and opens fire on an incoming target too small and too slow to be a jet, too fast and too erratic to be a helicopter. It is a drone, one of thousands crossing this exact stretch of front line every week, and the weapon tracking it is not a missile system at all. It is a 57mm automatic cannon, a caliber that sounds almost quaint next to the guided interceptors and radar-guided missile batteries most modern militaries have spent the last 3 decades building for exactly this job. On paper, using a rapid-fire gun to shoot down a cheap flying threat should be an obsolete idea, the kind of solution armies abandoned somewhere around the Cold War in favor of far more sophisticated guided weapons. And yet Russia's defense industry has, in the middle of its largest war in decades, rushed a brand new gun-based air defense vehicle into frontline service specifically because the threat it now needs to answer, cheap first-person view drones and loitering munitions arriving by the hundreds rather than the handful, has turned that supposedly obsolete idea back into exactly what the battlefield actually demands. Its name is the Tu-38 Derivatsiya-PVO, and unlike almost every other vehicle this channel has covered, it was not built to fight other tanks at all. It was built to shoot down the machines that have started killing tanks in numbers no earlier generation of armored warfare ever had to contend with. To understand why the Tu-38 exists, you need to understand a gap that opened up in Soviet and later Russian short-range air defense doctrine that nobody fully closed for decades. Through the Cold War, Soviet ground forces relied on a layered family of self-propelled anti-aircraft guns and missile systems, most famously the Z.S.U. 2-3. 4 Shilka with its radar-guided quadruple 23mm cannons and later the 2K-22 Tunguska, which combined a 30mm gun with short-range surface-to-air missiles on a single-track chassis. Both systems were designed around the threat environment of their era, low-flying jets, attack helicopters, and cruise missiles, none of which required the kind of extremely rapid, precisely timed engagement against dozens of simultaneous small, slow, cheap aerial threats that has come to define air defense over Ukraine's battlefield since 2022. Russian military planners had actually begun developing a successor system years before the full-scale invasion, first unveiling a prototype under the Derivatsiya-PVO name at the Army Defense Exhibition in Moscow back in 2017, built specifically around a single, unusually powerful weapon choice, a 57mm automatic cannon, rather than the smaller calibers used by its Cold War predecessors, a decision aimed at extending engagement range and lethality against faster, more capable aerial targets than a 1970s vintage 23mm gun could reliably threaten. Development proceeded slowly through the following years, the vehicle appearing periodically at military parades and defense exhibitions without ever entering full production until the war in Ukraine created 2 simultaneous and seemingly contradictory pressures. On one hand, the chassis the system was designed around, a variant of the BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle hull, became increasingly scarce as Russian industry struggled to replace BMP-3s being destroyed or committed directly to frontline infantry combat roles rather than diverted toward a specialized air defense variant still in limited production. On the other hand, the exact threat the Derivatsiya-PVO had originally been designed to counter, precisely guided munitions, and, increasingly, swarms of cheap commercial and military drones, exploded into the single most consistent daily threat facing Russian armored formations, turning what had been a lower priority modernization program into something closer to an urgent operational requirement. By early 2025, Russian state defense conglomerate Rostec was publicly pushing to accelerate delivery of the system to frontline units, specifically citing the drone threat as the justification, a rare moment of a wartime military openly admitting that an existing weapon category, gun-based air defense, had become more urgently necessary than the guided missile systems doctrine had spent decades favoring instead. The finished vehicle mounts its 57mm 2A90 automatic cannon, a weapon whose barrel lineage traces back to the venerable Soviet S-60 anti-aircraft gun of the 1950s, on the modified BMP-3 track chassis, combining the mobility and relative production familiarity of an already mass-produced hull with an entirely new turret and fire control package. The gun fires at a rate of up to 120 rounds per minute, engaging aerial targets at ranges between roughly 200 meters and 6 kilometers and altitudes up to 4,500 meters, with the barrel capable of elevating from -5 to a striking positive 75 degrees, allowing it to track targets passing nearly overhead rather than only those approaching on a relatively flat trajectory. Ammunition capacity runs to approximately 148 rounds, with some sources citing up to 200 depending on stowage configuration, drawn from the 57 by 348 mm 281 series family that includes both an armor-piercing ballistic cap tracer round for lightly armored ground targets and a high-explosive tracer round designed to fragment for maximum effect against aerial threats. Fire control relies on a multispectral optical electronic module combining television and infrared sighting channels alongside laser range finding, a sensor suite intended to let the vehicle acquire and track fast, small, low-signature targets, including reportedly detecting certain low-observable cruise missile types at several kilometers range. Though with an engagement window described by Russian air forces as lasting only 12 to 20 seconds once such a target is detected, a narrow margin that underscores just how demanding the modern drone and precision munition threat environment has become for any air defense system built to answer it. If you are finding this deep dive into modern military engineering and the ongoing evolution of air defense on today's battlefields useful, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep making this kind of content. What makes the 2S-38 a particularly interesting case study, distinct from nearly every other vehicle previously covered on this channel, is that its central design bet runs directly counter to a decades-long trend across nearly every major military toward increasingly guided, increasingly expensive interceptor systems for air defense. A guided surface-to-air missile offers a far higher probability of a single-shot kill against a fast, maneuvering target than an unguided or even a programmable fragmentation gun round, but missiles are expensive, produced relatively slowly, and each launcher can typically only carry a handful of ready rounds before requiring reload, a serious limitation against an adversary launching dozens of cheap, first-person view drones at a single position within minutes. A rapid-fire cannon like the 2A90, by contrast, trades a lower per-shot probability of a kill for a dramatically higher rate of fire and a far larger onboard ammunition supply, exactly the trade-off that matters most when the threat is not one or two expensive guided missiles, but a continuous swarm of cheap, disposable drones that a defender simply cannot afford to counter one expensive interceptor at a time. Military analysts examining the system have specifically highlighted this economic logic, describing gun-based systems like the Derivatsiya-PVO as a necessary complement to, rather than a replacement for, missile-based air defense, providing the high-volume, low-cost per-engagement layer that a purely missile-centric doctrine had largely neglected building for the specific threat environment Ukraine's battlefields have now made unavoidable for every army watching the conflict closely. The 2S-38's actual combat record remains, as of this recording, difficult to independently verify in detail, consistent with the broader challenge of assessing frontline performance claims from any actively fought war through open-source reporting alone. What is documented with reasonable confidence is the trajectory of the program itself, from a slow-moving prototype demonstrated at defense exhibitions years before the war, through a period where production remained limited partly by competing demand for the BMP-3 chassis. It depends on to an accelerated wartime push specifically justified by the drone threat, with the system publicly displayed at the Victory Day Parade in Moscow and at subsequent defense exhibitions including Army 2024 at Kubinka, and with Rostec officials speaking openly in early 2025 about pushing deliveries to frontline units faster than the program's pre-war development timeline had originally envisioned, that kind of accelerated, urgency-driven fielding, a weapon rushed from limited production into frontline service specifically because an unanticipated threat made it more necessary than planners originally expected, echoes a pattern this channel has documented before in very different contexts and very different eras, though unlike the tanks in those earlier videos, the 2S-38 story does not yet have a settled ending, a defining engagement, or a verdict rendered by history, rather than by an active conflict still being fought as this video is made. The broader significance of the 2S-38 program, whatever its individual field performance ultimately turns out to be, lies in what its accelerated development says about how quickly modern militaries are being forced to relearn lessons about layered air defense that many had assumed were settled decades ago. The drone threat that has driven this program's urgency has not stayed confined to the war that produced it, with military planners across NATO and beyond publicly reassessing their own short-range air defense gaps in direct response to exactly the same battlefield lessons Russian planners cited in justifying the 2S-38's accelerated deployment. a rare case of a weapon system's underlying logic being validated by an adversary's own stated reasoning, even as the war that produced that logic remains entirely unresolved. Whether the two S-38 specifically proves to be the right answer to that threat, or simply one imperfect answer among several competing approaches different militaries are racing to field simultaneously, gun systems, directed energy weapons, electronic warfare, and cheaper interceptor drones all being pursued in parallel by different nations, is a question this video, like the Leopard 2A8 covered previously on this channel, genuinely cannot answer with the confidence a completed historical account allows. The renewed relevance of gun-based short-range air defense is not a purely Russian phenomenon, and understanding the two S-38 in isolation risks missing the broader pattern it belongs to. Germany's Gepard, a Cold War-era self-propelled anti-aircraft gun-mounting twin 35mm cannons on a Leopard 1 chassis, had been retired from Bundeswehr service and largely written off as obsolete years before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, only to be pulled out of storage, refurbished, and delivered to Ukrainian forces in significant numbers starting in 2022, where it proved unexpectedly effective specifically against the same category of cheap drones and cruise missiles that two S-38 was later rushed into Russian service to counter. That parallel, two rival militaries independently rediscovering the value of a decades-old weapon category that defense planning on both sides had spent years treating as a lower budget priority behind guided missile systems, is one of the more striking convergent lessons to emerge from the war so far, suggesting the underlying tactical logic driving the two S-38's accelerated development is not a uniquely Chua Russian assessment of the battlefield, but a conclusion multiple militaries with very different doctrines and very different industrial bases have independently arrived at when confronted with the same drone-saturated threat environment. The two S-38's direct predecessors, the Shilka and the Tunguska, remain worth understanding in more detail precisely because the design compromises Soviet engineers made with those systems decades ago still echo through the choices made on the newer vehicle. The Shilka, fielded from the 1960s onward, paired radar guidance with four rapid-firing 23mm autocannons, offering a genuinely formidable rate of fire against low-flying aircraft of its era, but suffering from a relatively short effective range that made it far less useful as threats evolved toward faster, higher-flying, longer-range munitions. The Tunguska, introduced in the 1980s, addressed that range gap by combining a smaller 30mm gun armament with short-range guided missiles on the same chassis, a genuinely innovative hybrid approach for its time that nonetheless left crews managing two entirely different weapon systems with different targeting requirements, different maintenance demands, and different ammunition logistics chains, a complexity that the two S-38 single weapon, single fire control system approach deliberately avoids in exchange for giving up the extended range and higher single-shot lethality that Tunguska's missiles could offer against faster or more distant targets. Choosing a single larger caliber gun over a hybrid gun and missile combination represents its own specific bet about where the threat environment is actually heading, prioritizing volume of fire and simplicity of logistics over the theoretically superior per engagement lethality. A missile-equipped hybrid system could still offer against a smaller number of higher-value targets. Production numbers for the two S-38 remain difficult to pin down with confidence from open sources, a common problem when assessing any actively deployed system from a nation with limited transparency about its own wartime industrial output, but the trajectory described across multiple defense industry reports, from prototype demonstrations years before the war, through a period of constrained output competing for the same BMP-3 chassis production lines needed elsewhere at the front, to an explicitly accelerated push in 2024 and 2025 justified specifically by drone threat urgency, paints a consistent picture regardless of the exact unit count involved. It is the picture of a military rediscovering, under wartime pressure rather than through peacetime planning, that a weapon category it had spent years treating as secondary suddenly needed to become a priority again, a pattern of urgency-driven rediscovery that recurs throughout the history of armored and air defense warfare far more often than clean, linear technological progress narratives usually suggest. There is no ridge outside a small town to return to at the end of this video. At the end of this video, no single battle whose outcome retroactively validates or exposes every engineering decision that went into this particular vehicle, because that battle, if it comes, has not been fought yet in any way this channel can responsibly document today. What can be said with confidence is this. Every criticism leveled at gun-based air defense over the past several decades, that it offers a lower probability of kill per engagement than a guided missile, that its effective range against genuinely fast, high-altitude threats remains limited compared to dedicated missile systems, that it represents in some sense a return to a simpler, older category of weapon rather than a genuine technological leap forward, is accurate and has been argued by defense analysts for years. And yet the specific threat environment that Ukraine's battlefields have created, a continuous, high-volume, low-cost drone war that has made expensive missile interceptors an economically unsustainable primary answer, has pushed a major military back toward exactly the category of weapon that doctrine had spent decades deprioritizing, betting that raw rate of fire and ammunition capacity now matter, more than per-shot precision against a threat defined above all by its sheer numbers. Whether that bet proves correct is, for now, still an open question, being answered in real time on a battlefield this channel will continue to follow as the story, unlike every other tank covered here so far, is still being written.